Hi guys, welcome to the video and welcome to this beast here. This is the default Cessna, which is in X-Plane 11, and it's going to be the tool of choice for what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing the Garmin G1000, that is the default Garmin within X-Plane 11, and we're going to be running through a tutorial in regards to that. Now it's going to be broken down into chunks. It's going to be relatively detailed from a simmer's perspective. I'm adding in a bit of my real world knowledge, having used the system as well, but obviously from a professional standpoint of someone who may be using it day to day for instrument flight, then obviously this is not for training with regards to that. So just with that little caveat, this is a simmer's perspective on how to use this kit. Now most of us, if we have used this, will potentially have just used it on the basis of punching a flight plan, let's get going, let's get out of here. But what I will say is this is possibly one of the best G1000 interpretations I have seen in any sim. Now obviously I haven't seen all of them, but of those I've seen so far, this one is just brilliant, and yet it's the default G1000 with X-Plane 11. Absolutely gobsmacking. Now one of the things I'm going to point out here is that this avionics kit isn't just used in PPL style aircraft like this. It's used in a wide range of commercial applications as well. Very light jets, VLJs, used in a lot of aerial work in relation to air taxi, that kind of thing. So it's not just something for the the private pilot bimbling off to wherever for their hyper expensive coffee. It's actually also got an awful amount of if you like features that are of a professional level, not just let's fly our Cessna around. Now I encountered the kit when I was doing my instrument rating. In fact, I encountered it when I was doing my commercial pilot's license, because we used the DA40 for that. And then we used the DA42 for the multi-engine bolt-on, and then finally I used the DA42 again for my instrument rating. And that was predominantly where I encountered the G1000. Now what I'll say at this point is this thing's been around for years, and I did my instrument rating on it in 2010. So I don't know which model or which variation or which software update it is that they've worked this from, but because of that change in time, you can imagine that there have been a lot of software updates. There have been a lot of changes to it. There have been elements that have been added. I don't know any of that have been removed, but certainly there's elements that have been added. Now the other thing to bear in mind is that of course the equipment is dependent on the aircraft fit, and the aircraft fit is dependent on the purchaser, the buyer, the owner. So some aircraft will have ADF, and there is ADF facility within the G1000. Other aircraft will not be fitted with ADF, and so when they request the spec or buy the spec of the G1000, it may not have ADF in it. And actually in this case they've modelled an aircraft that doesn't have ADF in it, which is a bit of a shame, because I know ADF is not used as much in America as it is in Europe. But Europe kind of, there's very few now VOR to VOR routes in instrument flying. Virtually everything is area nav, so the G1000 is great for that. However, what a lot of airfields still have is they still have NDB approaches, non-precision approaches based off NDBs. So missing out the ADF is a bit of a shame with this. There is a workaround using the GPS system. However, I would stress again that that's not actually a legal thing to do in the real world. In order to fly any approach, the aircraft has to be using the specific aids for that approach. So in effect, if you're saying you're doing an ADF approach, you have to do it off an ADF, not knowledge of where geographic waypoint is. Because obviously in the databases, the two will tend to co-locate. In the database, it will have both the geographic position, so if you're navigating generally on our nav, it will have the geographic position in the database, but obviously you won't be able to receive any signals from it, and it's those signals you're homing to when you're doing the approach, not just this geographic position. So without dwelling on that too much, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this in some significant chunks. Now in terms of the chunks, we're kind of do this bit, the elements of the architecture. We're going to have a look at what happens in terms of the startup with single screen, layouts of the screens. Then we'll have a look at the soft keys, menus and logic in relation to that. The autopilot panel, the bugs that relate to it, because it's different when the autopilot is on to when they're off. When it's off. The basics of the FMS controls, so your flight planning, etc., VNAV, all that kind of stuff. And then what we'll do is we'll do a more practical element where we actually go and input a flight plan, we'll amend it, we'll cancel bits of it, we'll put procedures in, changing active legs, doing direct twos, and we can do all of that just messing around on the ground, and then we'll take it airborne and we'll have a mess around whilst it's airborne, and we can demonstrate a few things, such as how to work around the fact that this particular setup doesn't include ADF. As I say, it's a little bit cheeky. You wouldn't use it in real life, but from a sim perspective it's perfectly fine. We'll also have a look at some of the areas of the instrumentation that's not visible on the ground, such as trend markers or trend lines. Some of the things about cockpit management, because it's one of the things I would say is that more information is not necessarily better, because you need to manage that information. So if you were to compare this to a steam gauge aircraft, yeah, they look mighty complex, but actually the amount of information this thing can throw at you is horrific. We'll have a look at HSI modes, because there's some hiccups that you can get yourself stuck with in that. We will demonstrate mid-air changes to the flight plans, holds, descents, the NDB cheat, ILS, and then really we're going to wrap it up from that. So what I will do is I'll include the timings as we kind of go through each chunk as a set of comments in the comments for the video. So hopefully you guys enjoy what we're doing here. Obviously if you do at the end, please feel free to tick like, share, or even to subscribe to the channel and follow the channel. If you've got any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section as well. So let's have a look at the gross anatomy of this thing, and we'll kind of pull it apart a little bit, and I'll explain the key functions and the key parts of the unit. So you've got two big widescreen TVs. This one is slightly different because it has the autopilot down here. But other than that, these two setups are pretty much identical. So you've basically got what's known as your pilot's flying display, your PFD, and your ND, your navigation display. Now, each of these is attached to a separate avionics unit, so they're independent standalone units that talk to each other. However, there's some common elements that they share in terms of equipment or systems that they need to go through, and it's very similar in many respects to an airliner. So the first thing that gets added is this audio panel that you can see here. In terms of the audio panel, it controls both the audio for the radios up here, everything bar the frequencies, and then down here you can see it controls things like beacon idents, listening to beacons, etc. And in the actual real thing there's a few more elements to it that, for example, this play button is incredibly useful, but I'll maybe mention that later on. It's not significant to us, but it's a fascinating feature of the real aircraft. Now, in terms of the actual systems, if you imagine between the two systems there's also a number of very fancy computers. So there's an air data computer, exactly the same as an airliner. It takes in information in relation to outside air, airspeed, that kind of thing, and vertical speed indicator, etc. Now you do have secondary instruments here, which are all air-based, static dynamic air pressure instruments, but this doesn't just take readings straight off that. It takes the air pressure readings in relation to the air data and puts it into this air data computer to come out with a large selection of potential information from it, so things like true airspeed, etc. In addition, the most important thing that works between these two things is called the AHRS, the Attitude and Heading Reference System, which is exactly the same as an airliner. So an airliner, when you turn all the switches for the inertial navigation systems up on the top of the panel, right at the very back of the overhead, you have 2 or 3 switches generally for your INS, your inertial navigation system. Well, the underpinning thing of that is it has very sensitive gyroscopes, which is called the inertial reference system, and that's what works out which way up your aircraft is for your EFIS, for your electronic flight instruments. This is exactly the same thing. It has an attitude and heading reference system, which will basically tell you the attitude of the aircraft, rate of turn, whether it's skidding, slipping, whatever it is. But fundamentally it's very, very similar to an airliner, so it's got that element integrated into it as well. And obviously it's got the ability to detect separately to that, because one of the things inertial reference can do is it can detect true north, because it detects the rotation of the Earth, and obviously the Earth is east-west rotating, so by doing that the accelerometers in it are so sensitive they detect the rotation of the Earth and therefore can tell where true north is. However, there's also the need to identify magnetic north, local magnetic north, so you've got a magnetometer unit, which is exactly the same as you'd have in a normal HSI that auto slews to north. So it's a very, very similar set of sort of kit to an airliner in that respect. And then you've got a few other bits which may or may not be included in the G1000. In most of this they are. So when I flew the DA40 and the DA42, we didn't have an integrated transponder. And we did have an integrated transponder, but we didn't have the integrated autopilot that you see here. So our autopilot was a separate Bendix King one, which we had down here, whereas our instruments here were up here in the Twin Star. But the separate autopilot, I mean, it caused its own concerns if you were doing your instrument rating or you were instrument flying, because the barometric pressure setting was not automatically linked. So if you change your bar alt pressure setting for your minimums for your approach, for example, and you went from standard pressure setting to QNH, you also had to set the QNH separately down here. So we actually checked that the pressures were set 3 times, once, twice, and then the 3rd time was on the autopilot. However, that's not something we need to worry about here. Obviously it also has information coming to it from the engines, etc., for your engine panels and whatnot. So it's actually a very complex bit of kit. It's much more than just 2 TV screens, because it has these additional units. And then obviously, as I say, it has the autopilot unit. Now it can obviously then go beyond that, so some aircraft will have information in terms of data links, etc. The one that's I mentioned earlier is this play button, and you think, play, what the heck's that all about? Saved many a skin in terms of flying in controlled airspace. It replays the last radio message received, so if you didn't quite catch that clearance, you can just press play and it plays the last radio message received, and you can just make a note of your clearance as you do so. Very, very clever. I thought that was just genius, including that. Now in terms of the controls for the main unit, as I say, they are inextricably linked because the 2 screens are linked, so whatever you do on this is reflected on this as well. But they're very, very straightforward. So here is your volume in relation to your nav, and your nav is on the left hand side, including your altimeter. On the right hand side you've got your COM, and then you've got a few other bits of nav down here, but you've predominantly got flight plan related stuff down here. So if you like navigation, so here we've got nav radios, here we've got FMS style navigation. But to work top to bottom on both sides, just very briefly, you've got the volume for your nav radios, you've got a changeover which swaps over left to right. These are obviously the dials to control the frequencies. Press in swaps top to bottom will demonstrate that, because you get a block of information here that's easy to get confused, and you get a block of information here that's easy to get confused. Heading, simply just spin the knob and press it if you want to synchronize. Altitude, now the altitude dials here, knobs here, have 2 functions, and it depends on the mode your autopilot is in. So it can be used as just a normal bug as you would use if you were flying, say, at 172 with a bug that you can put on your altimeter. It depends on the kit of the aircraft, but let's say you can set an altimeter bug. It works exactly like that. However, if you have the autopilot on, the bug then becomes an altitude select, similar to an airliner's autopilot. I mean, I have to say this autopilot is epic. Along the bottom you've got the soft keys for all the menu choices, and then down this side, same thing, volume for your comm radios. If you push it in, you have squelch. I don't believe it's modelled in this. Same sort of controls for left, right. Press it again for up, down, and then obviously dial the frequencies with these 2. This one in the sim I find a bit of a pain. The outer one is your barometric pressure setting for your altimeters, and the inner one is your course. And I quite often find you'll be trying to adjust your course and you just accidentally flick it onto here, and unknowingly you'll be changing your pressure for your Q and H, and obviously that could cause issues if you're near mountains or in controlled airspace for that matter. Here's your range in terms of your ND, your navigation display. Small amount of flight plan buttons here in terms of you can have an inset for the flight plan here, and then the FMS knob, which is a little bit more than navigation. A lot of people associate FMS with purely navigation. Flight management systems control a lot more than just navigation by default of the name system, so that's a critical thing. Same number of buttons over here, but you'll find that the functionality here when you've got the ND, the navigation display, working is different between this. On this side it'll just work as an inset, on this side it actually affects the whole lot. Now, one of the things I will say is obviously, although this is a very good depiction of the system, it's not a complete study aid, and therefore there are elements, particularly of this side, the right hand side, that are missing. So very briefly we'll just fire up the batteries on this thing, and we'll show the initial screen you get is this. As you can see, it just instantly fires up as if there's no issues. It's got a flight plan in it that I recently flew, including an RNAV approach, so it will do procedures, it will do both SIDS and STARS, which is really great, because you can then obviously use this in places like Pilot Edge or VATSIM, and follow the procedures where it's not a beacon nav procedure, where it's area nav, which is fantastic. Makes this really useful. However, what you can see is you've got everything on one screen. Now, it's not particularly difficult to read, it's just knowing where everything is. So for example, we've got quite a lot of clutter on here because of two reasons. Firstly, I wanted to know things like the wind for landing and the minima. The second thing is that obviously we've still got all our instruments for our engines over here. So if I put the auxiliary on as well, you'll see that a lot of this jumps over to here, and you end up with your nav telly and your flying telly. So yeah, really good. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is just clear all this down, and then I'll be back with you in a moment, and we can have a look at a couple of bits in terms of the layout of the symbology in the screens. Right, PFD, Pilot's Flying Display. What we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the symbology and the instrumentation that's visible on the screen. What we're going to have to do in a bit is we're going to go airborne and demonstrate some of the bits that are not visible on the screen. Generally it's things like trend markers, and obviously because we're not moving there's not going to be a trend in terms of change of airspeed or change of altitude. However, your basic 6 are here, and it's very similar to an airline. So you've got your pitch ladder, you've got your roll here, you've got your attitude in terms of your references here, airspeed on the left, altitude on the right. The pale cyan, if it's a pale cyan colour, it relates to your bugs, so you can see that the heading bug is down here, 350, which matches there, and the altimeter is 2000. The bug, if it was down, would be down here. So the layout is COM up on the up on the top left, COM on the top right. The top line is your flight management system, where you're going. The bottom line is your autopilot status. So very similar to an airliner in regards to that. You've got your attitude indicator, you've got your HSI. Now there is a gotcha with the HSI in regards to making sure you've got it sorted with your autopilot. If you're messing around with your HSI, because obviously one of the things you do a lot with this sort of aircraft is GPS, but it might be that you want to set up the details for your say the bearing for your HSI for your ILS approach. You've got to be careful how you go about doing that, because you might cause yourself some issues. And bottom of the speed we've got TAS, bottom of the altimeter we've got the pressure setting that's currently set for the barometric pressure. Further to the right you've got warnings, and it does have the warnings down here. So red is warning, yellow is caution, and it will have alerts or advisories here which come up as white. If you press this button, you can see your first press is to acknowledge your warnings, your second press acknowledges your cautions, and then if there were any alerts they would be up here, and they would be, as I say, coloured white. It would be the inverse of this. So you can clear your alerts down here. If there were any, the final alerts page is this one, and you would be able to read out what they are. So this is just a straightforward HSI, and then along the bottom what we have is our soft keys, which we'll go through the actual menus in a moment, your outside air temperature, your ISA deviation, so plus or minus however many degrees. You've then got the buttons, the corresponding little menus for the buttons. I am forever getting this wrong, in as much as I will go to press, for example, DME, and instead of pressing here I'll press DME there and I'll call up the actual pop-up. Now the pop-up is very nice. The only problem I have sometimes is just getting some of these to line up properly. I can't remember which, the FMS I tend to get that one all over the place, yeah, because if you go to the top you can't do it, look, but you have to go to the sides to do it. It's not really a big issue, but yeah, I always want to use it in the 3D format rather than the pop-up, and I always end up pressing these buttons, so maybe it's trying to tell me something. I do not know. So in terms of manipulation of this information then, up here, as I say, top left, nav 1. Now this is the first big gotcha in terms of information. There's not a lot to indicate what the heck is going on with this. Outer frequencies on the left here, so nav 1, nav 2, outer frequencies. If it's left on the outside, it's your standby. If it's been brought into the inside, it's obviously more important, so it is your active frequencies. And there's two buttons that move this blue box around, the blue box being the same on both sides. It's the same setup basically on both sides, it's just one is nav, one is com, but the blue box is, if you mess around with these dials, what are these knobs, what are you actually going to affect? And in this case it's going to be the standby for nav 1. So you can see that I can move the outer knob, big numbers, little knob, little numbers, very straightforward. Now if you want to swap the frequencies, same as any other radio, you see this flip-flop switch is on virtually every other radio. Likewise, if you want to go top to bottom, you have to press the top dial in. And you see it goes top to bottom. You can never put this blue box over here because it's just the same as a normal radio, so you stand by and you're active. It could have been that when they did the ergonomics for this, they decided that when you did the flip-flop switch the blue box moved, but that wouldn't have worked. So very similar to a normal radio unit, it's just that there's a very large amount of data in a couple of square inches here, and the same here when you compare it to large radios, 737s or whatever have that kind of nonsense. But there's an awful lot of numbers, and if you're stressed, it's very easy to get confused as to whether that's the standby or that's the standby. The best way to remember it is you can only ever change the standby frequencies. So wherever the blue box is, that side is standby, and it's the same on both sides, as you can see. So in terms of how I then sort of, if you like, work this, my primary nav would always be on nav 1. That way I couldn't get confused. It would either be GPS or it would be nav 1. We didn't use the GPS because that wasn't the purpose of why we were flying, but this for me is always I do it the same way in every single aircraft. My primary navigation is always nav 1. My backup and or spatial awareness navigation aid is nav 2. Now say spatial awareness is crucial in navigating around in airspace, and whilst it's lovely to have a big picture over here, at the end of the day you still have to know things like, at what point am I passing this beacon, for example, at what point am I counting up or down on my DME. So if you're doing a SID, a standard instrument departure, and you've got a left turn at 1 mile, you can use another nav aid for that, and what we can do is call up various boxes down here. We'll go through that in a bit. Same thing with the com. The com, you can see the addition to it is the green. The green indicates that that's the channel that's selected for speech. So if I go down here, you can see change to com 2, it changes the green bottom box, the green text to the bottom box, or bottom, yeah. You get where I'm coming from. But actually it becomes very intuitive in terms of being able to use it. Obviously the fundamental bit is trying to manage the frequencies, and I did exactly the same thing with this. So whoever I was talking to was always on the top, and the bottom was what I used for ancillary stuff like ATIS, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's worth having in your own mind how you're going to operate this aircraft because of this risk of information overload. Heading, as is any other heading bug, you just turn it, it turns. One of the nice things is you have both the bug itself, the visual indicator, and also the heading itself as a numerical value. Quite important if you're holding, doing holding patterns, because this is a slow aircraft. One of the things that's significant is the faster the aircraft, the easier they are to navigate, because the less influence the wind has over them. So if you imagine if you have a 10 knot crosswind, it can really badly affect an aircraft that's down at 65-70 knots, but it won't have that much impact on an aircraft that might be holding at say 200 to 210 knots. So the higher the speed, the less impact the wind has. Obviously at at flight level 140, for example, you're likely to have more than 10 knots. But fundamentally the key thing here is that when you're doing holds, etc., you're flying them accurate to plus or minus 1 degree, really. That's what you're aiming for. So to have the numerical value of what your heading is really useful, because obviously you've also got a numerical value for your course. Now in terms of the bug, obviously if you then want to synchronize it, just press the button and it synchronizes. Really useful. One of the things to get into as a good habit is whenever you're not doing anything and you're just watching the aircraft do its thing and you're doing your various checks, whatnot, every now and again just synchronize the heading, unless you've put it somewhere specific as a reminder, at which point don't synchronize it, otherwise you'll forget your reminder. Common one for that for me is if you're manually flying a SID and you know that after a mile on runway heading you're going to turn left onto heading, preset the heading on that, because you know that you're going to fly straight ahead for a mile, so then you've not got to worry about trying to mess around with setting this. You can just literally turn to where the bug is. Altimeter down here, as I say, at the moment it's acting the same as a bug would if you were in a normal aircraft. So literally 100 feet divisions, you can set the altimeter bug. So it's digital as opposed to analog in this. I can't remember if in the real thing the divisions were smaller, but either way it doesn't really matter for the sim world. It's perfectly adequate for what we do. Along the bottom, outside air, 14 degrees C, ISA as I say in terms of deviation. Over here you've got your transponder, all the details regards to that. The transponder in this is very natty, and this is your local time down here. On the right hand side we've covered the COM, covered the course barometric pressure settings, so your barometric pressure there, and also your course, which changes your HSI. So changes your HSI course on nav1, nav2, but obviously not on the FMS if you're using GPS. Range, you can change the range of your nav display over here. Does zoom in quite far, but obviously there becomes a point where it won't zoom in any further, and it does zoom out quite far to the point where you'd be using intercontinental navigation. So that's pretty much all of the main controls there, and then the final bit down here is the flight management system sort of section, and this is fairly intuitive once you get used to it. It is a case of getting used to it and practicing with it though. However, a couple of things to be aware of. There is duplicity in certain controls, so these two are tied, these two are tied, and they're tied in the real aircraft so that you don't get yourself confused. But although there's one screen, these two are tied in terms of information, because fundamentally at the moment it is, to all intents and purposes, just one system. It's designed to be flown single pilot, but one of the things I found in regular use is you tend to actually use this block here because it's duplicated. Rather than switch from this side to that side to this side to that side, you tend to operate everything through this one small block here, which is it's a bit weird in some respects to go, well, how does that work? But it becomes very second nature to do so. Obviously if you're not messing around with a lot of the flight management stuff and you're not doing whatever you're doing, you can just concentrate on the one telly. But I have to say the signal's quite good in the telly, but I've yet to get Coronation Street. Now, really the only thing left to discuss in terms of controls is over here. You've got your autopilot controls, which are very similar to most autopilots, but actually they're closer to, say, a CRJ 900, something of that nature that hasn't got auto throttle but has a very high spec autopilot, because it will do a certain amount of vertical navigation in terms of alerts, but it won't do actual vertical navigation. It will, however, hold approaches. It will do area nav approaches. So it is quite a high spec bit of kit. And then you've got the soft keys down the bottom, which are slightly different, and you have the engine here, and then you have your main telly, and when you do the flight management stuff, a range of other bits pop up. So what we're then going to have a look at now is the soft keys and the menus and the logic behind that. Now the logic is that you have, if you like, a stem, and then it drills down into each if you like, branch of the tree or branch of the plant. Now the buttons themselves, really it's fairly straightforward. The inset is for down here. You can have an inset map, and then what you can have is, as I say, you're now heading off down a particular branch. So you can see it's changed all of the options on the soft keys. DCLTR is declutter, so you can have 3 levels of declutter, and what it does is it respectively removes things like airspace and airport diagrams, etc. Traffic doesn't change on and off here that I'm aware of, however it is, if you like, your traffic TCAS. Topo is topographical for this, whether you want it as just the symbology or you want the actual terrain on it. Terrain, it does have terrain. Nowadays, the terrain information that you see on your navigation display is from a geographic database, and the aircraft knows its exact position in space because of GPS, inertial reference systems, etc. And so it's not reliant on a radar, which obviously can be subject to clutter, it can be subject to inaccuracies and all sorts of problems with radar. You know, you can have rain clouds in the way, and then all of a sudden you've lost your ability to see what's beyond the rain cloud. So it is based on a geographic database as to whether that, you know, your height in relation to that ground height above a datum, which is mean sea level. So it doesn't matter what your barometric altimeter says in terms of pressure settings. If you get your pressure setting completely wrong, it's irrelevant. It is just the physical position of your aircraft based on your GPS and attitude system compared to the geographic database of the terrain elevation around you. And it has 2 colours. It has well, uncoloured, and then it has the yellow and the red, but we'll have a look at that. It's very, very good, very, very useful system, particularly if you're doing things like Innsbruck, you know, that stereotypical approach that everybody enjoys doing. Next rad is weather radar, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure quite what the state of play is with that, whether it works or not, but that's what its function is. The fact it's clickable implies to me that it probably does work. I just haven't had the weather set right for it to pick it up. And then obviously the final one is back, and as I say, the back button is always in the same place. So you go back to the trunk of your tree, so to speak, and if you go to the next button along, PFD here is all of the options as to what is displayed on your PFD, your pilot's flying display. We'll just get rid of the inset off. So PFD, defaults, wind, DME, bearing 1, bearing 2, altimeter units, standard barometric pressure settings. So if you're going into flight levels, etc. So working through it, the defaults, if you wanted to click that, there's nothing happens on this at the moment, but if you wanted to change some of these, then pressing defaults will take it back to where you were. Wind, you've got a number of options. It comes up here. Option 1 is just basically showing you the cross and head or tail wind as a numerical value. This is the usual wind arrow you see on airliners with a numerical value, which is great, but what you really want, in my opinion, is this one. So the wind arrow gives you your orientation. Is it a tailwind, headwind, whereabouts is it coming from? However, what you've got is you've got a tailwind, so what's your tailwind stroke headwind, and what's your crosswind. Very, very useful for navigation to know what your crosswind is, because it gives you the heading that you need to offset in terms of navigation. Likewise, tailwind headwind for holding is important for how long you spend flying on your outbound leg. So really useful little box that. Obviously you can turn it off, and once you're done with it, you just go back to the trunk of your tree. DME brings up the DME box. Now this is significant because you can change the DME source, but you don't do it through this. As I say, this is just displaying, this is just what you're showing. So DME, it's just on off. Same with bearing 1. Now your bearing 1 will be one of two things. It will either be the GPS or it will be nav 1. In this case it's nav 1, then it goes to GPS and then it buggers off. Same with bearing 2, exactly the same setup. It will be either GPS or nav 2 on this side. Continuing along, altimeter units, just whatever units, inches or hectopascals. Back. Standard barometric pressure setting, just changes that to standard. I must admit I never use that, I just dial up 1013, but obviously it's useful if you're in an area where or an approach where you might want to have your barometric pressure setting preset. We could mess around with that in terms of altitude, because our autopilot wasn't, it had its own altimeter, it had its own pressure setting for the altitude, so we can mess around with the pressure setting as much as we want here. But we can't do it in this, because as soon as you start changing the pressure setting you start confusing the aircraft as to what altitude you're actually at. So with regards to that, potentially with this you want to be pressing that button as soon as you go to standard and back. Now that's the PFD done. Gone all the way through those, so we're happy with that. Now the CDI is, once you start manipulating the CDI, what am I going to do? And really it only does one of three things. It changes the CDI in terms of which your reference CDI is, and you can see that obviously the course changes dependent on that. So you've literally just got GPS VOR1, VOR2. If it's ILS, you'll see it come up as localizer. So really simple. DME, this is where you change your DME source. So this won't change, it doesn't show you any data here, this is just where you change your source. You just skip over here and you can choose nav 1, nav 2 or hold. DME hold I don't use in the sim. In the real world you can use it in terms of it allows you to hold the DME frequency you're on in the background so that your DME will register reference to that, and then you'd be able to maybe change nav 1 to your actual ILS inbound heading if you wanted. It's difficult to explain, but the facility is there should you wish to do it, which generally I don't. But we'll put that back to nav 1 because that's, as I say, my primary navigation setup is generally nav 1. I do use nav 2 for certain things, but as I say, nav 1 for me predominantly. So get rid of the DME box. XPDR, transponder, very straightforward. Your three modes are here: standby on or altitude reporting, mode Charlie. VFR would be your VFR squawk. So this is obviously set up for the US at 1200, but in the UK it'd be 7000. So it's not really a problem. But you'll notice it defaults straight back to the trunk of the tree when you do that, because it says, well, obviously you don't want to do anything else. You've got the alternative if you want to put the code in here, so you can then put the code in and you just literally type it. So UK VFR conspicuity code is 7000, and again it just drops back to the trunk of the tree, the root of all of what you're doing. And then if you want to squawk IDENT, you can just press IDENT there, and it really is quite useful in terms of how it's set up. But we'll just demonstrate that if it's on, it comes up green with on, and if it's altitude or altitude reporting, it comes up green with alt following. So really easy. And as I say, if you just want to IDENT, press IDENT and it comes up with IDENT to let you know that it is currently in IDENT mode and squawking IDENT. So the final button that we're going to look at really is timer reference, because the nearest we've mentioned, but I don't really use that much. Timer reference, I haven't found a way of setting these on this. However, the timer reference, you've got different modes for it, and you've also got the start, stop, reset, and then you have your minimums down here. So we'll start with the minimums. Generally, I find you're going to want to, if you want to move categories, it's the outer one. If you want to change the value of that category, it's the inner one. So minimums, you can turn them on and off. Literally, that's it. And you'll see that it comes up with a little box for minimums here. If you turn them on, we'll have them off. The other thing to be aware of is the timer. This bit here, you can choose whether you want the timer to count up or count down. So if you count down, then you come back here and you can set whatever time you want it to count down from. And then obviously count up is there. And if you come over here, press to start, I'll mention that actually while I'm at it. The cursor is obviously inverse, so blue with the black text on top of it. If you want to get rid of the cursor on any of the menus that have the cursor highlighted like this, you just press that. And then what you can't do is you can't be an idiot and change something. But what we're going to do is do the start, stop, reset, which is just simply the enter button, start, stop, reset. So there we go. That's the final bit of the timer reference and the final bit of these soft keys down here. Now we'll just slide across to the right, because the soft keys down here you will notice are different, and the soft keys down here, now one of the things I noticed is I remembered when I was flying this thing that the amount of available menu options down here was significantly greater than we see here. This only appears to have nav, which it's a bit weird. I don't know whether that's been done deliberately. I assume it is. I assume we've just got a few of the pages missing off here. However, same nav and com data up here. This is subtly different. You'll notice it's subtly different because this is your leg that you're on, your distance and your bearing. On here you see you've got your ground speed, your direct track, your current track, and your estimated time of arrival. And then obviously it just tells you what your nav mode is for your system, unlike over here where you would have your autopilot status. So working down the left, you obviously have your engine instruments. You have a numerical value that's just literally as it says on the tin, and then you have the green bars. Now obviously this will vary dependent on the engines of the system. So the Twin Star, for example, and also the DA40, when it's got the Thealert 1.7 diesels, and I don't know what the latest engines fitted to them for the diesels are. I say diesel, it's actually Jet A1. So lovely 737s are actually flying around with diesel engines, or a form of diesel I should say. Basically, depending on the kit, depends on what you get. So if it was a more complex aircraft than this, you would have RPM and manifold pressure. If it was, say, a Twin Star, you'd have a percentage power, so it would go from 0 to 100%. And so, yeah, this is a simple single engine, so all you've got is the RPM. You've got your fuel flow, you've got your oil pressure, you've got oil temp, you've got your exhaust gas temp, your vacuum here, fuel quantities left and right, and then down here you've got your endurance, theoretically at that power setting. Sorry, your engine hours, my mistake. Down here you've got your engine hours, then you've got your state of the aircraft in terms of electrical systems, and your battery, whether it's charging, discharging, etc. If you press the system button underneath, you get additional elements in terms of the systems, and I haven't figured out what will flash up and what won't. But what you can do is, if you come here, you can, because aircraft fuel systems for light aircraft and general aviation are notoriously inaccurate, if you know exactly how much fuel is in your tanks, you would be able to increase and decrease the fuel in your tanks here. If you look here, you can see that we're increasing it by a gallon at a time. And you do that, use that in real life. You'll actually physically measure what's in the tanks, and then you'll vary your fuel accordingly. And if you wanted to reset the amount of fuel used, you just click there and it will reset it to full. Obviously we don't have full here, but that's what that sequence of buttons does. Nothing too dramatic there. And yeah, unlike the other screen, by the way, you'll notice it hasn't got back. You just click that. So where it's highlighted, or inverse I should say, clicking that button reverses whatever you did. Map, same thing as we saw the other place. Traffic, don't know if it works because you can't click on it. I assume it's potentially active. Topographical map, or without the topographical features. Terrain works whether the topographical is on or off. Obviously red is bad, yellow is not as bad, so red hurt, yellow about to hurt. Airways, if you want your airways on, you can pop your airways on and it will determine which airway you want as well. So you've got airways, airways on, which is all airways, airways low, airways high, and then off. And again we come back to the weather radar, which yeah, I can't honestly say whether or not that works. And then back to that, and then you can declutter this as well. So declutter exactly the same, 3 modes, 1, 2, 3, and chuck everything back on again. So that is the screens and how to operate the screens and the soft keys. So yeah, I think that's pretty much covered everything that we would want to cover there. Right, so I suppose this is kind of part 2 of the video, and what we're going to do is we're going to take it airborne and do it for real, FNAR. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at setting up our flight plan. Now yes, the engine's running in the background, but this isn't real. We've got no passengers, you know, we're not taking off from real world, so we'll just take our time and do what we need to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our actual flight plan. Now obviously if you call up this this screen, drag it over, does make it slightly easier. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our departure, and initially what we do is we call across the flight plan, brings this up. You can change the view of it, so we can go to wide, which I don't particularly like, although it does have a little bit more information on it over to the right hand side, but you can have it wide or narrow, leg to leg or cumulative, or in this case I'm just going to go back because I'm not remotely interested in that nonsense. Now at the moment it's recognised that we're Echo Golf November X-ray, so the first thing we need to do really is put into the system our departure, so procedures. And at this point you can see we've only got 3 options: select, approach, arrival, departure. Actually what I will do is if I go back a page, one of the things we can do from here, you see there's 2 pages down here, as long as you've not got your cursor specified, you can just skip across to here and it shows you previous flight plans you've used and it will store them. As long as you choose store, you can store them, and then if you go into menu here, in fact if you highlight it and then click enter, it will load that flight plan. So in fact what we'll do is we'll load that flight plan. You can see it loads up, and we've got our flight plan ready to go, so call up the flight plan window and that is it. This was a previous departure down to where I flew down to Land's End, which was quite a long way, but it was very enjoyable, and the weather wasn't great, has to be said. We ended up doing a bit of a dive bomb approach towards the end. It was an instrument approach into Land's End, but it was quite fun. However, if we want to get rid of our flight plan, then one of the things we can do is go to menu, in fact clear flight plan menu, and then we go down here and we can just scroll down to delete flight plan, enter. Now beware, because it doesn't give you any warning, it will just get rid of it. So we're back at our base, if you like, our start, and what we're going to do is start to populate our flight plan. Now one of the things we're going to do initially is going to have a procedure, approach, arrival or departure. Well, we want departure, click enter, and it comes up with a choice of available instrument departures. We are going to go for the Daventry 3 November, so enter that. Comes up with all the waypoints and it asks us if we want to load it. Yes, we do want to load it, and you'll see now we've got the departure on here. So if I just quickly get rid of the flight plan, then I can scroll out a little bit. You can see there's our departure disappearing off to Daventry. We'll keep that zoomed in a little bit. Flight plan, back to this. You can see it zooms back in for the flight plan, just so that you can check your waypoints. And it's just like a normal FMS in as much as if I check the waypoints by bringing up my cursor and then I scroll down each one, you can see it follows it just like an airline or FMS. Now obviously it's pre-populated the altitudes. You can see above 810 by 2.4 on the DME, which is actually 1 mile from the opposite other end of the runway, which we'll go through as the departure. The magenta arrow is the current leg that you're going to, if you like, the current waypoint you're going to fly to. The cyan inverse text here is basically where we're at, and I'll describe some of the other features of this once we've got a couple of other waypoints in. So the next waypoint we've got to Daventry is going to be via an airway, and yes, you can put airways in. What you have to do is you then go all the way down here. I always make sure that my cursor is in the blank bit at the bottom. Menu, and you can see now what we've got is load airway as an option. So scroll down to load airway, again using the outer knob. Click that and it gives you the options of the airways from the location, which in this case we want the Mike 189. Mike 189, so we'll scroll down, press enter, and what it'll do is give you the exit point choices. So all of these are intersections where you could potentially leave your airway, and at the moment what we want is we want let me just have a look. We want admiss, so we're going to scroll down to admiss, hit enter. It checks if we want to load it. Obviously it gives us the waypoints so that we can see the waypoints. Yes, we want to load it, and it's chucked it in. Now this is a useful point to discuss the layout of what you see here. It's actually really useful. Where you've got a block of something that's happening, so in this case we've got a block which is the departure. After that we've got a block which is the airway. What you'll see is at the start of each block you've got white line of text which gives an abbreviation as to what this next block is. You will also see the waypoints are indented. So this line here is where if I put my next waypoint in, which is straightforward, it's simply at Barkway. So if I put that in here, onto this, Bravo Kilo Yankee, and then enter that, it will obviously want me to confirm that it's the UK as opposed to Ivory Coast. Enter that. Now it's got the position uploaded. In effect it says, do I want to accept that now as part of my flight plan? Now you can see here basically the white heading is for a group or a clutch of waypoints that have an association for some reason. So it can either be a departure, an approach, a star, it can be an airway. Any of those will be headed by a white line here with an abbreviation as to what the next sequence of waypoints is. At the end of that sequence of waypoints, which are all indented, then it stops indenting. So if you like, the airway is only for these waypoints, and then we've got a normal beacon here. What we're going to do next is we're going to go on to another beacon at the in fact another airway, and you'll see what happens now. So we've got our last point there. What we're going to do is just go back into menu, load airway, and it comes up with the possible options from that position from Barkway, and we want the Mike 183. Now there's two there, so I can only assume it's heading in two directions from this position, so let's see what happens. Yeah, you can either go Nugbo or you can go the opposite way. Well, admiss is basically where we've come from, so we don't want this direction, we want this direction. So we're just going to go to Nugbo, which is the next one, and you can see it's coming back this way now. Load it, yes, airway Nugbo, down to the final line here. And what we're going to do is just go for a direct to silver at this point, which is a waypoint. It's actually on that same airway, the Mike 183, but for some reason it's not registered in here. Now obviously you can see as I'm putting the details in, it's pre-populating stuff that it thinks I might want in terms of, if you like, either the next waypoint or whatever it might be. And actually what it's come up with is gone, well, the only combination that's now left for me is silver. However, there are three alternatives, so Venezuela, Hong Kong, but we want the UK. And in it goes, enter to accept, and that's that done. So the only thing we're going to look at now is the arrival, and what we're going to do as an arrival. So what we do need to do is we're going to do our actual arrival point, which is Echo Golf Tango Charlie. And stick that in, and there we go. That is our route. Now you see obviously if I get rid of the flight plan, we kind of double back on ourselves, and the main reason for that, here we go, it's because I don't really want to go firing off into the wilderness. What I want to do is have a route where I can in effect hold not too far from this position. I wanted to demonstrate the SID, and unfortunately SIDs tend to be a relatively long ground track. This one in this case is about 45 miles or something like that, and then obviously we've got the opportunity to mess around with the legs down here. So I'll cut the video at intervals so that you guys aren't sat there for the next hour and a half watching us at 172 plod along at 100 knots. But that in essence is what we're going to be doing as our route. So let's get the range of the map back down to something reasonable. Now at this point, procedures, we're not going to select an arrival, but you can see it's got an approach and arrival and obviously our departure, and it's actually loaded the approach and arrival information. We don't really want to do that at the moment. What we're going to do is actually then fly our route, and we're going to select it as we're en route, which is reasonable because you don't necessarily know what the wind direction is when you get there. Now, talking of which, we're going to have a quick look at the actual approaches. This is Navigraph. I find this absolutely awesome because nowadays what you have is the ability to link it with a sim, and if you link it with a sim, what you get is a symbology as to where you are. You can put in a route. The route isn't always great, but you can see that this is basically where the SID is, down to Daventry down here, but the actual routing is out here somewhere down that way. But it's good enough for government work. You know, at least you get some idea of what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the departure. In terms of the departure, we're going off runway 27. So standard instrument departure 27 Daventry 3 November. And you can see here now what our routing is. And in terms of our departure, it's fairly straightforward. We will mention it. Transition altitude 6,000 feet. What we're going to do is depart on runway heading, tracking the runway heading for 1 mile on the DME from the India Echo Mike Echo. Left turn to follow a ground track 225 degrees. Left turn at 6.5 miles on the DME, although we will probably be closer to track 160 inbound to Daventry, at which point we're at the end of the SID. In terms of altitudes, the first checkpoint really is at 1 mile, and let me just get the altitude for that. Climb straight ahead, 1 mile on the India Echo Mike Echo. Well, it's got an altitude on our GPS, but it's not on the plate, so I'm not overly concerned. We should achieve it anyway. But the first check, 7 miles on the DME between 3000 and flight level 90, 31 miles from Daventry, 5,500 to flight level 90, and then at Daventry we need to be at flight level 90. That's quite interesting in many respects for a SID because obviously I think, you know, over in the States you guys have 18,000 feet before you get to your transition altitude. In the UK, out of controlled airspace, it's quite commonly 3,000 feet. In controlled airspace it's generally 6,000 feet, but this is one of the SIDs where we pass through the transition altitude. Now obviously it's transition altitude on the way up, transition level on the way down, but that doesn't really matter because we're just continuing up. The only other thing to mention really for me is the minimum safe altitude, or the minimum sector altitude. I call it the minimum safe altitude. I can't recall after all these years what the specific term is, but it's based on the Echo Mike Echo NDB, which obviously is an issue because we can't receive that in this aircraft. We're not ADF equipped. However, northwestern quadrant is 2700, and then the rest of it's 2500 on the QNH. So that's all very good, and we should be well above our climb gradients with this aircraft at this weight, so it shouldn't be an issue with that. So that's our departure. Obviously, we're not worried about things like speed, but we're going to be looking at that, and what we'll do is set up the instruments accordingly in a bit. In terms of our arrival, let's go back. Charts. Now approaches, we're not going to use a star. There's some fascinating approaches, actually one that's not demonstrated on here, the JEPs. One that's not on the JEPs here is there is actually a VDF approach, which is a fascinating approach. Basically it is a homing approach where as a pilot you make a sequence of transmissions, QDM, I think it is, requesting QDM, and what then happens is the controller gives you the bearing that you are from them. So you're bearing out to your aircraft, and you basically home to the overhead using these verbal bearings that are given by the controller. Once you're overhead, you then turn outbound, generally on an outbound track for a given time. Again, you're given QDMs as you go outbound, and then you make an inbound turn, QDMs on the way in, and you descend. And it's a fascinating non-procedure approach, and unfortunately you can't really sim it. unless you have I don't know, maybe somebody who's really skilled as a controller on VATSIM could do it, possibly even Pilot Edge. I don't know if it's used in the US, to be fair. However, it's there. It's something that you can use here, and I think I used it once at Leicester, I want to say. I think I've used one once at Leicester just for training, and it was really quite hard, if you'll excuse the phone. Now, there's only one ILS approach. We're going to be going for the ILS approach, which is to 2.1, and you can see here what we do have as the start of the approach is the Charlie India Tango localizer beacon, which we're not fitted with ADF. So how do we overcome that? We're going to use a nominal ADF, which we're going to do using the GPS, and I will show you that in a bit. Now, in terms of the actual approach itself, we can brief that later down the line, but you can see that basically all we're going to do is home to the Charlie India Tango. Once we're there, we're going to fly this teardrop outbound. There is an alternative procedure that if you're holding, you'd be able to extend the hold on time or DME and then turn back inbound, which is one of the things that they do. This airfield is used commonly for instrument rating tests. So the multi-engine IR or the single-engine IR in the UK, it's got, I think it's probably, it may have changed, but I think it's probably still got the Civil Aviation Authority exam centre there, which is a rather scary place when you sat there waiting with your bits of paper and whatnot to be examined. But you can see 850 sorry, Charlie India Tango. We would normally use that as a beacon to home to, and then obviously hold off that. Now we're not going to faff around with the hold, we're going to go direct to it, and then we're going to do our teardrop. Outbound is Cat A 018 degrees till 8.6 on the DME, and then we're going to spin around and we're going to come in and track 212 inbound. In terms of altitudes, 3,500 down to 2,500 for platform altitude, and then it's 3-degree glide slope. But we'll discuss that in more depth as we get there. Obviously bear in mind that the minima for this, we don't have rad alt luxuries, so we will be going off decision alt for the ILS. Obviously different minima for the non-precision localizer approach. Beacons, etc. We'll talk about all of that as we're on route, but it's going to be an interesting approach. We'll see how we get on. I haven't flown, well, I've flown maybe 1 or 2 ILSs in the last 6 months, so we'll see how we get on. That's my caveat. I'll declare that early. However, we're going to depart from here, so SIDS 3 November, and as you can see we're sat at the threshold of 27. So that's the plan in terms of what we're doing. We're not going to set up the approach and the arrivals. You can see that they're blank at the moment. We don't need to worry about that, so let's get rid of all of that and we will sit there fat, dumb and happy with that. The next thing really is to look at how we're going to set this lot up. There's an awful lot of information we can set up here, and one of the things I've mentioned previously is we don't want to overcrowd it with information. So the first tape up here is very similar to some of the stuff you would get, particularly this bit in terms of an airliner FMS. We've got further data over here, 4 different bits of information, and obviously if you wanted you could get ground speed direct track, the track you're actually covering over the ground and the estimated time that you're looking at there. But in terms of our critical information here, we've got the waypoint or the leg we're on, the active leg, the distance and the bearing for that leg. Now setting this thing up, this is going to be the autopilot or flight director information depending on which we've got selected. Setting this up, really there's probably about 2 or 3 blocks that you want to look at. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the nav, and if you remember off the chart, the only beacon we needed was Daventry 116.4, which is a common beacon I use because I fly around here. And when we select it, you get the green DTY, a Delta Tango Yankee, which is Daventry. Now because this is self-idented with the text here, I don't need to do an audio ident. And that's pretty much that. Looking at my route planning, however, my next beacon is actually this one, 116.25, which is Barkway, although we're doing a bit of a kink before we get there, so we're not going to be directly navigating to that, but it potentially could be useful to have set up or preset as a frequency here. So we will preset it because it would be the next along route navigation beacon that we'd be using. And one of the things I learned is if you're on the ground sat there, you might as well set up as much as you can for the opening few legs, so that if it is for whatever reason busy, you can then just crack on and get on with what you're doing. Now nav2 wise, if you remember, we had to check 1 mile on the DME for the India Echo Mike Echo on the outbound for that initial part of the leg. So what we need to do is change our frequency here, so we drop down and the frequency for that is 10935. Should know that, I've flown in and out of East Mid so many times. 10935. Swap that over to our active frequency on this side, and you can see India Echo Mike Echo is there, so we're happy with that. Always make an effort to just drop this back up as well for me, because obviously quite commonly you're not going to be messing around with these frequencies that much if you're using this as a primary. So that's the nav radio setup. We will make a mention in terms of the CDI with regards to that. The CDI has 3 modes with this, GPS, nav1, nav2. So if we go to nav1, the first thing to notice is that the text up here has gone green. What this is telling you is that this frequency is what's being used by the instrument itself. If you then wanted to center this, if you wanted to mess around in terms of positioning it, one of the things you can do here is, yes, you can adjust the course, but sometimes it takes a while. If you press this though, it will center you in relation to that beacon and which way you've got to go for that beacon. Not going to do that though, because we know that the heading or the track we want towards Daventry is 160, so we can set that up nice and easy here. That's a gotcha, that is. Gotcha. If you are off this, even slightly, you'll change the barometric setting and you don't always notice it. So 1013 we've got as the pressure for today. We're flying in standard ISA conditions for T's and P's, temperatures and pressures, etc. Now that in effect is our reserve now for our climb out. So CDI, we don't need anything on that. We've got the GPS. What we will do in a bit is, in fact we'll do it now, we'll go to the PDF and we'll call up the DME and the bearing 1. So bearing 1 needle here is pointing towards Daventry, and it will give us some situational awareness. The other thing we want is we could have bearing 2 up for our ILS in terms of measuring. We're 1 mile away, but you'll notice that all of a sudden this becomes very cluttered. So maybe a more elegant way of doing this is to use the DME, at which point we can then just scoot back here and we're going to choose the DME and we want it on nav 2, and then that all of a sudden should be good. Select nav 2 and you can see it's changed now. So actually what we've got is we're using only the DME element of nav 2 at the moment in terms of the data that's there. However, what we do have is our needle. So as you can see, it's nice and uncluttered. It's fairly straightforward in the navigation. So we've got our primary data here with the purple or the green, depending on which one we're going to use. Always set up your radio nav aids as a backup to the GPS. The GPS isn't infallible. It's great as a bit of equipment, but it is not infallible, which is one of the reasons why our nav approaches took a while to get to grips with, is that the authorities were a little bit reticent to start relying on pure GPS approaches, but now with the integrity monitoring that goes on, generally they're very, very reliable. But you can lose signals for GPS, so as I say, where possible you're always taught to always use your radio nav aids as a backup and try and keep them current. So that's us set up with that. The only other thing to mention is the heading bug. The heading bug, you can sync it if you wanted to follow that heading out of the runway, but there's a couple of points here. The first thing is we know we're only flying straight ahead for a mile, so any pilot who can't fly straight ahead for a mile needs to maybe review their piloting. But what we do know is that after a mile we're going to turn left onto 225, so we might as well preset that. And the idea behind that is it's much easier to fly to a bug than to hunt for a number. So I now don't need to remember that number as I launch off into the skies. I can just basically go, all I have to do is remember for a mile on here, turn left onto where this little blue bug is, and we're happy days. And that gives me a little bit of time to gather my thoughts whilst we then intercept the 160 on this. Now as I say, this will give us, that looks like it's at 170 to me. Ah yes, it will be, because it's pointing at there. I'm on about this being the 160. So yeah, I mean basically when these two line up, you know that you're flying along that track. So the CDI is set up, everything I want in terms of my available windows is set up. The only thing now to do is just to go through a few things. There's nothing to set up here. In terms of this screen here, the only things we would be setting up potentially are flight director if we wanted to use it, and or presetting autopilot information if we wanted to use that as well. And then altitude in terms of, there's two things really to check. I suppose there's three things to check. The first thing is your preset altimeter. So the preset altimeter we're going to set is actually 9000. I always wish, this bugs me, 9000. And this is going to be both a preset and also alt select when we get up there. The next thing is a gross error check. Does this look reasonable, and does this look so, you know, is this what you're expecting as a sort of pressure setting? I mean, it is 1013, so we're happy with that. Now we're back on our main page here. The only things we would need to consider now are the transponder, which for us is 7000, and you can obviously choose standby, on, alt, and in this case we're going to go to alt, and you'll see that what happens is when it's got an active mode it goes green, or when you've made an alteration to it in its active state it is green, and we can obviously change the code, the squawk ident and the VFR there. So which is, it's important if you're departing from somewhere like Cranfield. Cranfield hasn't got a radar, so quite often you're joining airways, and the first thing the ATC will want you to do is squawk ident so that they can grab you and pick you up if you've come out of an airfield that's not direct into a SID, for example. So that's set up, and then the only other thing we need to do really is we would consider this. Now let me see, I don't think you can, no, you can't set the VXVY that I can figure out here. It won't let me go to it, so you can't set up your VXVY and your best glide, which is a shame. And obviously at the moment we're taking off, so we don't need minimums, and we're not going to use the timer, so at the moment, yeah, that's all good. Now before we go any further, I'm going to mention one of the massive pitfalls is this button here. So let's call up the flight plan. We've got our magenta arrow here saying that our active leg is between these two positions, and obviously our active leg is the magenta line here, which is all very good. If I press this direct to button, so let's say we're going to go, you know what, we've been given a direct departure to wherever, they want to get us out of the way because they've got an airliner following us. In effect, do not use this button. This clears your flight plan. So what will happen is if you use this as a direct to partway through your flight plan, you'll just clear your flight plan. So what you need to do is you need to actually go into the flight plan page over here if you want to do direct to. Just a very, very significant warning there, because obviously what we don't want is part way through a route to be sat there with our head on fire, rubbing our head with our hands going, what the heck has just gone on here? Don't understand it. So just straightening everything up, we're going to do our departure now and get out of here. So as I say, we're going to climb to 1 mile ahead, and then we will route accordingly. Now one of the things I've noticed when I boot up light aircraft in this, for some reason the nose wheel steering switch is active, and you have to put that on for me. I don't know if that's a bug or if that's a design flaw or whatever the heck it is. I really don't know what's going on with that, but I'm hoping I've got my nose wheel steering on, because I've got nothing in the cockpit obviously to tell me what's going on. And at this point we're pretty much ready to go. Now as I say, I haven't flown a 172 in quite some time, but we'll see how we get on. So we'll just take the power off, we'll release the brakes, and then we'll power up. Don't need to slam the power open that quickly. We've got a large runway. And here we are tootling down. It's going to rotate at 60. As I say, I don't know the speeds off the top of my head, but generally speaking, if it flies off nice and easy like that, you're not too far off. Now I think the best climb speed is about 80 knots, so let's just trim and let ourselves accelerate to 80 knots, and as we do so, obviously we're starting to get to the top of the white line, so retract the flaps and wait for it to dip, and there it goes. Now we're not quite on our runway heading track. The GPS can help with that. Is this trim working, or is it just very slow? I think maybe it's just a bit slow. Okay, so as we're flying away now, you can see that we're drifting left of track. Sorry, right of track. We're going to come back on, and we're going to track that magenta line outbound. Now what we're doing obviously is we're looking for this to increase to 1 mile. As long as it's increasing, we know that we're doing the right thing. We're still right of track. My rudder pedals are, I've got some new ones on the way, so these are only going to be temporary for a little bit longer. I've just got to tolerate them. So 0.3 on the miles, track miles from the beacon, or the ILS DME I should say. Gradually starting to bring the course back in. Bearing in mind that if it's a navigational beacon, this offset is in degrees, whereas if it's GPS or something of that nature, then actually it's actually mileage that you're off. So it's just turned, but we're going to wait till 1 nautical mile. We're going to do it properly. Just need to pitch up a little bit. And in any case, with our radius of turn, there's no point turning too quickly anyway. Okay, so as we come around, obviously I don't need to remember the heading because I put my little bug there, but we're going to just cut it short so that we can gradually come back onto our correct track. Now this is a good opportunity to talk about spatial awareness, because obviously you can see this needle now is moving from 170 around towards 160, and we know as it approaches 160 we're going to be encountering another left-hand turn to join the 160 radial. So that's quite a useful bit of information. We don't need the DME nav2 now, so what we're going to do is get rid of the DME, declutter ourselves. Now at this point what we're going to do is just discuss trend data. The telescreen has quite a lot of trend data, but it has 3 main pieces of trend. It has speed, altitude, and obviously heading. Now the first one we're going to do is heading, for which I'm actually going to get rid of the bug. I'm actually tracking 225, but there we go. Okay, turn coordinator. How do we do a rate 1 turn with this? A coordinated turn at rate 1. Well, the first thing is you need a properly working set of rudder pedals to keep the ball in the middle. The second thing is you need to actually know your rate of turn for a standard rate 1 turn, and that's down here. So you see there's a little tick to the right of this white arrow, and a little slightly larger one to the right of that, and what these indicate is your rate of turn. So you've got a half rate turn and a standard rate turn here. Standard rate being to turn the heading, change heading by 180 degrees in 1 minute, generally used for holes or turns as directed by ATC. Now with regards to that, what we're going to do is just have a look at it. Obviously the rate of turn is affected by 2 things, your angle of bank and also your rudder position. So it's not going to be pretty because my rudder pedals are knackered, but we'll try and demonstrate with a rate 1 turn to the right, which is about there. Oh, my rudder pedals are all over the place. Which is about there, and that's rate 1. If we want to do half rate, and the only reason that I would consider that I would do a half rate turn is if I have a small heading change, and then we're going to do a rate 1 turn round to the left, trying to keep the thing in balance. Just watch your speed, Richard. You're a little bit quick there, a little bit slow I should say. And there's our rate 1 turn to the left, bouncing around a little bit, but nonetheless you do get the idea, I would hope. So that's the turns, and obviously the trend data is that magenta line, so the length of the line just shows you how quickly you're turning, which is a very clever system. It's very easy, very intuitive, much easier than a traditional turn indicator, because it's actually, if you imagine, the advantage now is your turn rate or your turn indicator is directly on your navigation instrument. It's overlaid, unlike a more traditional steam gauge cockpit, so it's very, very good in that respect. This is coming down slowly towards 164, so what we can do is come back round here, and then we'll wait for that intercept to come in. As I say, for smaller heading changes I'd tend to use something like a half rate turn. So we'll put ourselves here to the right of track. We shouldn't need too much to get back on track. Okay, so the next bit of trend data we're going to look at is here. Obviously magenta line, if it goes down below the center, you're increasing. Sorry, if it goes above the line, you're increasing. If it goes down, you're decreasing. So as I shove the nose down, what we will see is that we've got 10 seconds to a left-hand turn, so we'll just steady ourselves for that. First, ATC would be screaming at us at this point. And then there we go. We don't need to do too tight a turn because obviously we're only doing 100 knots, whereas an airliner is going to be doing considerably more. We're just going to stop a few 10 degrees short or 5 degrees short, depending on how this line comes up. So we'll just stop about 10 degrees short to join the track. So as I was saying, trend data here, so magenta above means that our speed is increasing. So nose down, speed increases, magenta line goes above. The rate of change is signalled by three things. It's signalled by the length of the magenta line and the direction of the magenta line, the rate of change of these numbers, and the rate of movement of the speed tape going past. The altitude has exactly the same thing. So what we've got is our magenta line, which shows that we've got a rate change of an increase in altitude. If I pull back, you'll see that it increases in length. This whizzes past faster, this increases faster. If I push forwards, you'll see that we've got the opposite. So the line goes down, the further the line goes, the greater the rate of descent. Now obviously, being a nicely created aircraft, we do have other indicators for rate of climb, rate of descent, which are over here, which I will mention once we're on autopilot. So we'll just come over here and we'll discuss the autopilot. Now if I just click flight director, that's all we get is our magenta showing roll to maintain the roll that we engaged it at, flight director, and to maintain the pitch with alt select all of a sudden. So you can see now we've got our alt select, and in effect that's pretty much where we would go. If I then plug the autopilot in, you can see we've got the autopilot. Can take my hands off the controls and basically it just sits where you are. A couple of things at this point now is, well, we want to go somewhere, so let's just slew our heading to it and press heading, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. Want to change our heading, decrease it, the aircraft turns left, increase it, the aircraft turns right, and if for whatever reason we need to do so, we can just sync the heading thus. Now that's a really useful tool. You use that more than you would believe in real life. So let's just get ourselves like this. Now obviously pitch is not the ideal mode. Ignore the turn and slip because I can't be bothered with that really. Unprofessional, I know, but you know, let's accept that we're not in the real world here. We're discussing the electronical wizardry and witchcraft that's here. 2,000 feet to go. So the next thing we need to consider is our pitch modes, and we've got three pitch modes. The one is pitch hold, which is not really any use because it doesn't give us any speed protection and it doesn't give us any control over the rate of climb unless we've done this and we've actually pitched it to our climb speed roughly. Now the first mode is the common one that you see in most aircraft, vertical speed, and basically the little blue caret appears here at your selected vertical speed. At this point it comes in at whatever vertical speed you were doing at the time, and it will just maintain that vertical speed. Nose up, nose down. Nose up will obviously increase your vertical speed, correspondingly your speed will decrease. Nose down will send it the other way, and correspondingly your speed will increase. Now the problem with most aircraft is as they climb they become slightly more asthmatic and your climb performance reduces. So on that basis it's nice to have some sort of security in speed so that you don't, because obviously if you have a vertical speed but you're struggling with your performance, what will happen is you'll continually pitch up, trying to maintain that vertical speed, and as you do so your actual indicated airspeed will decrease up until the point that you stall, and then you crash and burn and die if you stuff up the stall recovery. So a better option may well be to do flight level change here, which is not something that I'd encountered because I didn't have the the autopilot as part of the system here. 1,000 to go. Now what this does, you can see up here, it's got flight level change 75 knots. 75 knots isn't the best climb speed for this, it's about 79 or 80 knots or something like that. So if I press nose down, I will increase the speed and we'll go to 79 knots, and you'll see that we've now got our little blue caret over here instead of here, and in effect what we're going to do is accelerate to that speed, maintain that speed. Now the key thing here is we're still on heading, but what we can do is we can just go for nav and the aircraft will sort the navigation out for us. So now we're really set up almost airliner-esque. It's beautiful, it's a work of art. And it really is quite decent in setting it up like that. You've got your safety provisions set in now. That in effect what we've got is speed protection because we're in flight level change. We've got climb and we've got alt select, so we've got we know we're not going to bust our altitude. Now we would obviously have some time previously have swapped over to standard, but we are at standard anyway, so we don't need to worry about that. And lastly, we've got our nav aid backup here. Good to go. The only thing I'd say at this point is we don't need the India Echo Mike Echo, so once we're level we would want to potentially look at what we're doing in terms of DME, and the only other nav aid that really we need to worry about DME wise is 11625, which tells us how close we are to Barkway. So I'm actually going to swap that over. You could hang on to that because that's your ILS frequency for east mids, and obviously if you had to do some sort of recovery for whatever reason you'd be able to just go straight for an ILS and you wouldn't have to mess around with anything. But that really is looking at the whole process in terms of just a departure. You can see now it's changed to alt 9,000 feet, and really this is the fundamental bits of this are now over. So just let the speed increase and then we'll chop it to 2400 RPM. Not going to bother with the mixture. We're not going to crash and burn on this. Excessive fuel flow, well I don't pay for the fuel, so what we're going to do now is call this bit over here and we're going to have a look at a couple of bits. So let's zoom out and you can see the next waypoints are listed down here, and if I bring up the flight plan, here we go. Now the first thing I'm going to look at is making alterations to where we're going and what we're doing. The first thing I'm going to look at is actually how do we do a direct to. I'm going to do a direct to Daventry here. Now in terms of a direct to at Daventry, how do we do that? We do not push that button, but there are two ways. Basically to do direct to, you change your active leg, and there's two ways of doing it, but they work fundamentally the same. If I press active leg here, nothing happens until I've got my cursor, and then what I can do is, there we go, bump bump. If I now press active leg, it will make that leg the active leg, like that, and you can see the little magenta arrow changes. The line here changes. If I get rid of the flight plan page, you can see now it's in effect skipped that and it's gone, right, you want that as the active leg, not a problem. So that's how you do it through the flight plan. The other way of doing it is to go through the menu. So one of the things we can then do is look at going to, say, Olney direct, which is quite some distance away, but we can go direct to Olney, and what we would do in those circumstances, we'd actually go to menu, activate leg, and it'll do exactly the same thing, and you can see now we've got a leg to Olney. So there's two methods of doing it. You can change your active leg down here, straightforward, so you choose your whichever waypoint you're going to go to, click active leg, and you can then go direct to that. As I say, do not use this direct button if you value your flight plan, this direct to. In effect what it's saying is trash everything else. What we want to do is just fly to that point. We will be using it later to do our pseudo navigation beacon for the NDB, but we're not going to do that at the moment. So what we're going to do now is looking at adding and deleting waypoints. Now these are all along a straight line, so they're not really going to affect our actual path of flight. However, let's say we wanted to add a waypoint after Potton. We would go here, and then what we would do is select a waypoint. We're going to go to, I don't know, let's go to Echo Golf Bravo Bravo. Echo Golf Bravo Bravo. I'm going to pop that in, enter. It's going to ask if I want to accept it, enter, and there you go, we've got Echo Golf Bravo Bravo's dropped in exactly where we wanted it. So again, if we want to do it for POTIS in relation to Potton, we can do exactly the same thing. So we go there and then we turn the little inner knob. And we'll do Charlie India Tango in this one. Enter, enter, and you can see now what it does, and it drops it before whatever waypoint you've selected. So you can see that we selected Potton, we put EGBB in, selected Potton, put Charlie India Tango in. If we want to remove the waypoints, dead easy, we just go to there, choose the waypoint without dropping off there, and we just press clear. Remove EGBB, yes, and clear, remove that, yes. And that's it, so we're back to that. So in terms of the setup so far, we've covered departures, we've covered we've covered putting a flight plan in, we've covered procedures for departure, we've covered direct twos, we've covered what else we've done, adding and removing waypoints from the flight plan as you're on the go. And all you've got to remember with the adding and deleting, adding, it will go before whatever you've selected, so in effect it will go between the preceding waypoints, and then obviously if you delete it, just highlight it, it will double check that what you want to do is delete it. Now one of the things we've not done is we've not done a great deal in terms of VNAV. You can of course set all your profiles here, but I'm not going to do that if I'm going to be blunt about it at the moment. So that's where we're at with that. What we're going to do is let the flight continue a little bit more. I'm going to do a shortcut so we can mess around a little bit more. Let's wind ourselves out. And we're going to do, we don't want to go to Potton, we're going to go down towards Silver. So you can see it's actually now coming down to intercept this point here. It's literally just gone, you know what, forget that. So we're going to go to Silver. We're not going to go all the way out to Barkway because we don't need to, and then what we'll do is as we come down here we will descend. So literally same sort of thing, we can go down here to Silver, don't hit that direct to, instead we want an active leg, at which point we know that we're going to come down here and to Silver, enter, and our active leg is towards Silver. So where's it gone? Here we go, this is what we're after. Now our arrival is fairly straightforward as well, really, so we want to go here, 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 and we're doing the ILS for 2-1, so let's call that up. In terms of briefing, we would look at setting up all the instrumentation first, and then we would brief to make sure that we've confirmed we've got it set up. So reading off that, we're just going to change a few things, going to bring that up. Now in terms of navigation, we're going to be using the ILS, which is 108.9, so make sure we are on the top row, and we're going to go 108.9. That's what we need. We're not using VOR navigation now, so we can chuck that straight over. And then what we can also do is come down, and I would suggest do the whole thing at the same time. So if you like, we're adjusting our nav 1 down to the CDI, down to nav 1, and then what we're going to do at this point, I've just been caught out by my gotcha. Because I've changed this, notice it's gone to roll mode. So let's get it back to nav, and I'll show you what you need to do to save any embarrassment. Pop that there, back to nav. Okay, so the GPS and the autopilot are on. The trick to get that sorted are to go heading hold, and then we can change our CDI, because we've only got one source of navigation which the autopilot can fly from, which is this. So whatever mode this is in, you're stuck with it. But we know our inbound heading is 212, so over here we go over here and change our course. Not our barometric altitude, or barometric pressure setting I should say. 212. So that's us set up for the ILS. We've got the details there. It's not picking anything up, but that's not a problem. What we're then going to do is go back to the GPS. I'm going to plug our nav back in so that we're happy with that, and it will just adjust itself for the slight drift we've suffered. So our course is set in for nav 1. We're quite happy with that. What we need to do as well now is we just need to make sure that our DME is set to nav 1 just to back that up. So we'll do that. Enter. So the DME, should we need it, is backed up, and actually we're starting to pick up a signal now, but obviously in real life I doubt if we would get that there. So nav 1 is there. We can leave the needle there because I want to see if we start to get a signal with regards to it. Now here's the trick we're going to do in terms of the beacon, is we're actually going to tune or we're actually going to direct the GPS to Charlie India Tango. We're not going to do it for a while. We'll wait till we get a bit closer, because what we want to do is then in effect steer ourselves around. Now the only other things I'm going to do here actually is I'm going to have 108.9 on the reserve as well, just in case for whatever reason we do have an issue. 108.9, and we're going to just chuck that over so that we've got both of them, and obviously we would check that they're idented. Jump back up to the top. Comms would be whatever comms are, obviously we're not messing around with that. Now the final thing we're going to do is in effect brief the approach. We're at flight level 90, we've got plenty of time to get down at the moment obviously. Now in terms of the approach, localizer we've got tuned, final approach course 212 we've got set, locator beacon, we don't have a locator beacon but we can use the Charlie India Tango navigation point 1560. Decision altitude is 558, we're not equipped with a radalt so we can't use decision height. Airport elevation, so this makes sense for us, 200 feet above. Missed approach details are there, and in effect what we're going to do now is just go through the chart. What we're going to do is home to the Charlie India Tango at 3,500 feet. We're then going to turn outbound Cat A 018 degrees till 8.6 on the India Charlie Romeo DME. Then it's going to be a rate 1 turn to the right to join 212 inbound course towards the airfield. In terms of the actual horizontal profile, 3,500 feet, we're going to do a descending outbound leg to 8.6 on the DME. We're to the platform altitude 2,500 feet, right hand turn all the way around, inbound course 212. Going to continue inbound until 6.6 on the DME. We're going to descend on a 3-degree glide slope. Our decision altitude is our decision altitude is 558 feet, and our check to make sure that we're descending appropriately is 1560 at the Charlie India Tango overhead. That we do have DME, so we don't need to worry about this section at the moment, and the only other thing is the RVR 750 meters, which we've got plenty because we've got full airfield lighting system. So we're pretty much good to go. The only other thing to mention is the sector altitude, so 2,000 feet minimum safe altitude to the east, 2,200 to the west, and finally the missed approach. We're going to climb straight ahead 1,500 feet and then a climbing left turn 2,500 to join holding again, which is over Charlie India Tango. And the holding is nice and handy because it's 212 on the inbound heading. I'm going to be doing a teardrop join here. So yeah, deep joy. We've got all our beacons set up, so we've confirmed that. We know what we're doing. The only thing we're going to look at in terms of descent is we're going to look at the altitude in terms of flight level change, etc. So yeah, I think that's us good to go. At that point, if we had crew or anybody else with us, we'd be going, well, has anyone got any questions? But at the moment, I'm going to cut the video here whilst we fly a little bit closer to Silver. Cranfield in the UK. Let's go. So on this note now, what we're going to do is go direct to Charlie India Tango. We've got 10 minutes to get down, so we're going to go down to 3,000 feet. So what we need to do now is look at our vertical navigation, because we've only got, what are we looking at, 10 minutes to go. And in this case we're looking at 19 miles, so we need to go down to 3,500. Altitude is down here, 3,500, and we're going to go to vertical speed for this, so just call this up. In fact, we'll do it from here so that we can see what effect we're having here. We're going to go to vertical speed. I'm going to go down about 700 feet a minute, I would have thought, so nose down, 700 feet a minute. And one of the joys of this is you can actually almost select your vertical speed just by simply the number of clicks you do. So 7 clicks, you know, is pretty much going to be enough. So we've got how much longer? 9 minutes. 9 times 7 is 70, 60, so we're going to get down in plenty of time. Because we're now going this way, let's just sync our heading. Now at this point what we're going to do is we've got GPS which is going direct to Charlie India Tango, which is great. But what we're also going to do is we're going to call up the second needle now. So CDI, and we want it to go to PFD, sorry, bearing 2. Now this double needle now is going to act almost as an NDB. It's going to permanently point towards Charlie India Tango. We're not tracking it, we're not going to the green needles or anything nonsense like that. We're just literally going to use it as an indicator as to where Charlie India Tango is. And what that means is we can then, as we close, we can get rid of the GPS, we can put our navigation in appropriately in terms of our primary symbology on here being nav1, but now we've got a needle that will always point towards Charlie India Tango. Now I must stress, obviously this is not what you would do as an approved approach. As an approved approach, if you've got a beacon such as this, you'd have to have an NDB. You cannot, to the best of my knowledge, do a legal approach such as this without an NDB. But we're in the sim to start with, it's not real world, and what we've got is a workaround, particularly on the basis that there's a lot of airfields and a lot of beacons, NDBs, still on airways in the UK. But what we're going to do is we're going to just chop the video now and we'll see how we get on, and I shall speak to you guys in a bit. Okay, so we've got 8 miles to run to the Charlie India Tango. What we're going to do now is we're going to set ourselves up for the approach. So you'll see we've got GPS autopilot. We don't want GPS autopilot. We're going to swap it across to heading. So we'll just change that to heading. You can see heading now. We've got our bug pretty much synchronized, so that's not a problem. Now what we're going to do is pop back to PFD, and we're going to change bearing 1 to and at this point what we're going to do is we're going to choose our CDI to the green, and just checking we've got our course 212, so that's going to be inbound. Now at the moment we've got nav1 on the needle. We're not going to use nav1 on the needle anymore because we've got the green nice green fancy thing, so we can get rid of that. PFD bearing 1, get rid of that for the moment. Going to keep the Charlie India Tango because what we're going to do is we're going to manually home to that. However, what we also need to do is we also need to offset ourselves slightly to the right, and then what we're going to do is see that this needle is going to start to come round, and we want it to come round to somewhere near 030. Now for those who aren't familiar with needle flying on instruments, the mantra is that you push the head, pull the tail. So this is the tail of the needle, head is up here. If you want the head to move that way, you push the head so that you're outside of the head. So let's say the head is here and you want it 060. If you were here, you'd push the head to the right. If you're on this side of it, you push the head to the left, and you'll see it will start to come around. In fact, we'll make it a slightly more apparent change. We'll fly 110. If, however, it's the tail that's up here and you're flying away from the beacon, you pull the tail. So if we wanted this needle, the tail of, assume the needle's the other way around, if this is the tail and we want the tail to go to here, we would fly here and we would pull the tail. We would fly inside the tail, or would potentially even fly over here. But in fact, sorry, we would fly over here, so we'd want to pull the tail in this direction. So push the head, pull the tail, and it's pretty much as simple as that. Now we've got 3,500 coming up now, so I need to just be careful. You can see it's changed over to Alt and put us back up to our cruise power setting. We're going to continue in at about 100 knots. 2,300. Actually it'd be slightly less because we've got slightly more power at this altitude. We're not quite as asthmatic. So as it comes round towards this location, what we're then going to do is we're going to look at going outbound on 018 from the beacon, and as I say, this is now acting as our pseudo NDB. Not forgetting, as we're going out, we want 8.6 on the DME, so what we will do now is we'll call up the DME for the outbound so that we've got our mileage, and we can see that we're at 3 miles, but it'll obviously close as we go in. So we've just crossed through the centre line really, or sorry, it's getting a signal. 060, we need to start considering a turn fairly shortly. We'll probably turn when we get to about 045, maybe even 040. And the aim is that we don't want to do this sort of screech into the beacon and do a very tight turn. We want to offset to the right, to the south of it, so that when we come back round, we've got a much more gentle join to the beacon. Because otherwise then what we do is we fly to the beacon and we're going to struggle to get this 018. We'll end up doing a sort of dumbbell the opposite way to fly out, which is not really very helpful at all. So now we'll start to come round. And you can see that by doing so we're pretty much going to go inbound on the needle. Now this is pretty much the reciprocal of the inbound course. The inbound course is 212, the reciprocal 032. So we'll just continue just to the left and we'll home the beacon now, and that's all we're going to do is we're going to home the beacon to the overhead using our pseudo NDB. So it's quite useful if you want to fly or practice instrument approaches with this in the UK or other European states where you've got an NDB approach. You can actually do it. So you can see actually we're not too far off our outbound heading. Our outbound heading is going to be 018, or our outbound track I should say is 018. Arriving at waypoint, half a mile to go. Just checking this down here. It's all looking quite good, and as you would expect, look, the localizer's coming in. So we're going to wait for the needle to turn to flip. And there it goes, and we're just going to go to 018 immediately. What we also need to do is we need to descend, so it's quite easy with this. We can just do one blip, that drops us 1,000, and then we can go over to vertical speed, nose down. Probably about 400 feet a minute should be adequate. Make sure we take plenty of power off, because what we also want to do is consider slowing down, ready for our turn. Slow down to about 90 knots initially. And one of the things we can do to help ourselves out here is we can slow the aircraft down, because it gives you more time to do whatever approach you're doing. So 018, just to double check, you can see that we've got the tail here perfectly on 018. If it was left or right, you would want to adjust, because that's indicating your ground track. It's indicating the bearing to your NDB, but it's working out quite nicely at the moment. So we'll just add a little bit of power to stabilise us at 91 knots. Coming down nicely, we're looking for 8.6, so we've got 2 miles. What we will do is we'll increase our rate of descent a little bit. Bring the power off. And one of the things we need to remember is that when we're looking at our platform altitude, we need to make sure we're not going to go any lower than 2,500 feet. Just coming up to 1 mile to go. 400 feet to go. It's going to be quite close, but we'll get there. What we'll do at this point is we'll take the autopilot off and the flight director. We don't want either of those, and we'll have a go. As I say, I haven't flown manually for an ILS for quite some time. We'll level, we'll let the speed bleed off to about 80, we'll put the first stage of flaps and we'll do our turn. So And one of the things we need to make sure is we don't bust our platform altitude. So what's that, about 1 or 2 degrees up really was going to help. A bit late on the turn there actually, because I was not paying attention adequately. As I say, we're looking for our rate 1 turn. Just increase the speed a little bit. A little bit low with the speed. Altitude's good. Turning a little bit too tight with our rate 1. There we go. Climbing a little bit too much, so what's that, about +2? Seems to be there or thereabouts. What we'll probably end up doing is levelling. Oh no, there comes the localizer. This thing's not trimming very well at all. So we'll just slow our turn. Give the localizer a chance to catch up. So localizer live, glide slopes are live. Watching for the pitch, we're just going to put another stage of flat down. That speed's dropping off very quickly there. We have bounced a little bit. And our approach speed, we're going to fly 70 knots, I think we'll do that. That's very remiss of me, missing the course like that. Now, bearing in mind that this is only a few degrees wide in terms of a track, and then what we'll do is we'll chuck the final stage of flap out as we actually intercept the glide slope. Try and get this thing trimmed out. For whatever reason, I really struggle with the trim on this aircraft. So localizer's coming back in gradually, but very gradually. Glide slope's coming down. Airspeed's crawling back to where we want it. Watch the pitch. We'll try for about 4 degrees nose down, shall we? Let's watch our heading. Need a little bit more, maybe 5.5 degrees. Watch our airspeed. Watch our heading. Watch our rate of descent. 1560 as we went over the Charlie India Tango was one of the checks we were looking for. I'm going to leave 2,500 because that's our altitude if we were going to rejoin the beacon. As I say, 1560 is the next check as we go over Charlie India Tango. Going a little low, so we'll just let the nose drift up to there, which is about -4. See what impact that has. We're drifting ever so slightly to the right. No indication of movement from Charlie India Tango. Only 1 mile to go to it though. Right, I've just hoovered that back in, although we did so with quite a significant heading change. Need to stabilise this really. Get a nice stable set of numbers. Pedals aren't helping. I'm drifting slightly left again. Sorry, slightly right. About 4 degrees nose down seems to help. My trim, however, doesn't. Waiting for the Charlie India Tango to spin. You can see it's becoming a little bit sensitive now. It's off to our left slightly, although I'm going to track the green needle because that's obviously our approach. Arriving waypoint, so now it's only got a couple of seconds to go. That's going to spin around. We're looking at the altitude. We want 1560 as it spins. There it goes, and we're at 1600, 1580, so we'll have that. It's not too bad, that's about 20 feet too high. And now we can ignore that unless we have to do a go around. Heading's gone awry, so let's get that back. And just as a reminder, we're looking at 558, I believe it was, as our decision altitude. Sorry, decision altitude. So 212, just a little bit above glide slope. Try and get this rather naff trim to work. Just need to come right a degree or two. Checking our altitude, 1300. So that's about 800 to go. Drifting slightly left, so correcting a couple of degrees to the right. That's all we need to do to correct. Speed is good. We've got full flaps. Gear is fixed. Excuse the dog. The dog's grumpy today, I know not why. We're going slightly low. As I say, half scale deflection is far too much for this. So we've got 400 to go basically. Well, 440 there or thereabouts. 213, just a little bit low. You could, if you wanted, set the altimeter bug to your decision height, or you can just remember it. Dog's going for it, must be the postman. I cannot be getting on with the trim on this thing. So we're drifting slightly right, but we've not got far to go. So I don't want to do too big a heading alteration, otherwise what happens is we struggle then. Slightly low, correcting. 40 to go. Let's go up here, get rid of that. We'll take those bananas, I think. Oh, ruined. Ruined. Oh well, never mind. Okay, welcome to Welshpool, which is on the Shropshire-Welsh border, I seem to recall. However, it's a very small sort of general aviation airfield. Very nice, flown into it a couple of times. Hasn't got the longest runway in the world, but they're restricted in their patterns. They've got to do patterns to one side because they've got high ground on the left. It's not exceptional high ground, and on the right. So I can't remember if it's left or right actually, but yeah, that's just my memory for me. Now what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate this bad boy. So we'll take off, and as soon as we go to take off, we're going to go to the autopilot so that we can then look at the changes in this without crashing. So what we do need to do is we do need to set this up. We're going to go direct on runway heading. We're not going to mess around with anything else. We don't need any needles here. So you can see we've still got the needles up from what we were doing because we're not doing any radio nav. Doesn't matter about this, although what we will do, we'll go back and we will put it to something that's a little bit more familiar. At this point what I can do is, one of the things I always do for orientation is I will tend to, I'll tend to bring it round to show me the orientation of the runway. I've got an alert that's come up. So 036, so if we ever have to come back we can orientate ourselves with the runway. Set course to 091, I don't want to. In fact what we can do here is we can deliberately detune that, and then that will get rid of any alerts. clear that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to climb out, and I'll set the altitude, the initial altitude, to say 6,500. We're not going to climb that far, and we want flight level change. The autopilot's not on at the moment, it's flight director, but we'll go auto change. We'll set the speed to 80 knots, which is best rate of climb. 79, 80 knots, something like that. And we can do all this on the ground because it's flight director. And then what we'll do is we'll get airborne, and we can plug in the autopilot, and it will be there ready for us to go. So what we will do is, if we go into menu, in fact it's that screen for it, menu, clear, flight plan menu, we'll just scroll down and delete flight plan, enter. So that's not going to cause any confusion. Flight plan, get rid of that for the moment. And what we're going to do is take off, and we'll look at the changes in this, and it should be fairly straightforward, because we're in Snowdonia, or we're just on the edge of Snowdonia, and Snowdon itself is only about 3,000 feet high, I think it is, something like that. Very nice hill to wander up, but there we go. Let's get ourselves airborne and get on with it, shall we? So first stage flaps are selected, brakes are off, nose wheel steering needs to go back on again because it's stupid how that works. And I hate that wheel scrubbing sound in X-Plane 11. It was there in 10 and it's in 11 as well, and I hate it. Rotate. That can go up like that. Then what we can do is we can just press autopilot. It should do all the things we need to do. Now I've taken the pedals off, I can't be bothered to make sure that that's all working. However, what we can see now is, as we're climbing, you can see the pattern changing. As I say, yellow is obviously caution, red is danger, and we can fly straight ahead. It's basically in a valley. And the direction we're flying, which is tracking 035, we're actually heading towards the lower areas of the valley. And if I just move that to one side, in fact, if I do shift 4, get rid of that for the moment, you can see the ground that we've come out of, this sort of bowl here, and we're moving towards an area where you can see over this way we've got Wales with various mountainous areas. Over this way we've got England, and we've just got this high ground to our right hand side, which is fairly close. So back inside, call this across, and as you can see now we're green. So this green channel that we're flying out of is basically means that we're entirely safe within that area. We will just reduce the range a little bit. Red is still elevated high above us, so you can see now this is Snowdonia. Really nice walking up around here. This is the Brecon Beacons down here, down this neck of the woods, and really nice. But you can see as we climb, our risk is receding as we go out here. So a very nice feature. It does work. As I say, it's worth bearing in mind that this stuff works off GPS and navigation databases. It is not a terrain radar. That's not how these things work these days. Right, so what we're going to do at the moment is we're going to discuss how we're going to sort out an approach. And what we're going to do, let's bring this up here. What we're going to do is, this is Charlie India Tango, which is the initial approach fix. Here's our airfield, 3,500 feet. What we're going to do is we're going to do a teardrop, come back round, and we'll do a start at the initial approach fix. And what we're going to aim for is an ILS to 2-1 in terms of the procedures, but the way it works is, it does, in fact, the best way to do it is to call up this flight plan. In fact, not flight plan, procedures. So what we're going to do is we're going to select approach, which is going to be an ILS to 2-1. Now there's two clear and distinct RNAV approaches. That means every aspect of it is flown pure RNAV. There's no need for any other gauges or instruments to be set up for the approach. You would only set up things for issues with the approach where you wanted to revert to normal nav aids. However, the ILS 2.1 is a normal nav aid approach, but what it does is we will select that. We're going to come around this way and join here, so that's a sector 2 approach, or sector 2 join I should say. So we'll choose the sector 2, enter the barometric minimums 560, and then what you can see is the sequence is, that's not going to let me zoom, Charlie India Tango over the top of the beacon. We then go outbound 013, then we turn back inbound, we intercept the centerline fix and then the final fix, and it gives us the choice down here whether we want to load or activate. Now the only thing to be aware of at this point, you also get the chance to put your minimums in, which are 560 for us. It's actually 558, but you always round up to slightly to err on the side of caution, so we'll load that. That's now in the system, and you can see what we're going to do is come back over here. The hold is here, and the hold is in here because basically the missed approach is to continue climb to 1,500 feet on runway heading, turn around all the way back, intercept Charlie India Tango, and then if you need to go into the hold, you'd be able to go into the hold, and from here you do a teardrop hold. However, what we need to do is think about coming back in towards Charlie India Tango. So, without further ado, we can get rid of that for the moment. We're going to turn left, and the way I've got the nav aid set up I shall discuss as we're in the turn and we come round. The single needle nav, if you look at the bottom left, is set up for Charlie India Tango. So the single needle is looking at the geographic waypoint Charlie India Tango, and that's what we're going to home in on as if we were homing on an NDB. The DME is set up nav 1, which is the ILS. Now what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are on heading, and then what we can do is do the following. You can go to CDI, localizer 1, and we can make sure we've got 212, localizer 1 is all set, and then if you wanted to change it, if you were to change it now, you'd be changing this particular thing here with the course. So you change the course. So we can make sure that that all looks good, all makes sense. Heading, we can still home to our Charlie India Tango beacon fine by doing this. In fact, we'll just push it out towards 014 a little bit by going the opposite side of it. You push the head, pull the tail. CDI, we're going to go back to the GPS. Like that. Now the only thing we need to do is going to go direct to activate, enter. We're going to go to nav at this point. Nav is there, and we'll navigate straight towards the beacon, direct to. And the final thing we need to make sure that we do is we need to actually activate the approach. So what we'll do is we will go down here, go for the procedures button, select approach. Well, we've done that, we've got our approach, so we need to activate approach. Enter, and what that means now is it should follow the approach. So if I then go to flight plan, got all the details here. Current VNAV 3,500 feet at Charlie India Tango is where we're going to be. We're fine for all of that, and then procedure, you can see it's selected and active. India 2-1 Charlie India Tango 2. So that's all good. Flight plan, don't want the flight plan anymore, can get rid of that. Next thing we need to do is mind our altimetry. So we've got the lateral navigation sorted. Altimetry, what we're going to do is, because we're on alt hold, we can move our pre-selector down to 2,500. And if you look, we've got GPS, make sure we've always got it set up. GPS, autopilot on, alt hold 3,500 feet. Pre-selectors to 2,500 feet with the correct QNH. Barometric minimum are set here, and we're all looking good. We're on GPS, we've got the nav1 tuned, idented and lined up 212. You can see that the course here isn't showing 212 for the green needles for needle nav, which is why we had to do that heading hold, swap over, make sure it's all correct, and then go back into the procedure. Looking at this, we've not got far to go now before we're going to get all too excited. So what we're looking at, about half that distance, which is about 3 miles now to run. but that I can figure out. We are all pretty much configured. What we're going to do is when we go into the approach phase, we're going to descend outbound to 2,500 feet, which is here, but we're also going to make sure that we go down vertical speed relatively early, so 500-600 feet a minute rate of descent, so that when we get to the bottom of that ramp we can bring the power off a little bit more, and we can decelerate, and we're going to do the initial turn with first stage flap at 90 knots, see how we get on. One of the things to bear in mind, as I say, is not to press that button, but when you come over here you'll see that we've got this little straight bit here. This is its intercept course when it goes from the magenta GPS nav here. In fact, we can bring the range down a bit. As it goes from here, magenta, this becomes the next active leg. It goes magenta, we follow this. This is magenta, we follow this. This is magenta, but what it's looking for is to find the green needles, to get that that signal off the green needles, at which point you'll see it swap over between the two, which is really rather handy. And it tends to work quite well. However, we're getting to the exciting bit here. We're going to see what it does. See what it does. There we go, direct track 014, 10 seconds to the turn, 0.4 miles. Confers with this, which is our little blue needle here. And you'll see the little blue needle will start to swing as we on-top the beacon. And as we go over the top, we're outbound 013. So now we need to start our descent. What we can do is we can do vertical speed, nose down, take some power off so we don't speed up too much, and down we go. And we're outbound now 014. Now what we're going to do is we're going to continue down on our descent as we go merrily down the hill. And what we're waiting for really is to get level at 2,500 feet. We need to monitor our distance in terms of that. Now the Charlie India Tango needle, we don't really need that at the moment. We would only need that if we were doing our go around, and we could always select that at the time. So what we're going to do is go to PFD, we're going to get rid of bearing 1, we're going to tidy it all up. We do however still need the DME, because it's the only place on this that you'll see the DME being indicated. It isn't indicated anywhere else. We'll just pop the nose down a little bit more. Make sure we get down in time. Down to 2,500 feet, so we're just coming up to 400 feet to go. 6.3 miles out, and we turn in at about 10 miles, I think it is, something like that. Coming down nicely. And I think we're just coming out of the cloud, aren't we? Yeah, we're out of the cloud now. And I'm going to leave the power off to let it decelerate down to about 90 knots initially. In fact, we'll leave the power off. We'll come down to first stage flaps. We'll do about 80 knots. And I'll put the first stage flap in before we do the turn onto the intercept. And this has quite a pitch change and quite a speed change with first stage flap. It wants to pitch up quite badly, and if I do that you'll see it drops the speed very quickly, so we'll just catch it with a bit of throttle. It's a difficult one at that point. Do you preempt it with the throttle and risk overspeeding the flaps, or do you let the flaps come in? I mean, in the real aircraft you can almost do the two simultaneously, quite straightforward, but here we're kind of juggling things and letting it happen. So now what you've got here is a vertical path deviation indicator, which is very different. So that's the kind of thing you get in RNAV. That's not what you'd get in the green needle nav we'll see in a moment, which is your glide slope. Right turn to 152 in 10 seconds time, which is coming round here, look. So we're right at the top of our route here. 2,500 feet is our platform altitude. You'll see if I was kicking the rudder in, which I can't be bothered with, really unprofessional of me, we would potentially be doing a rate 1 turn, but with my rudder pedals, they have a really bad notch in them, but it's not central, it's off to one side, it's slightly left of centre, So as soon as I try and use the pedals, it just goes notch in and seesaws either side of that notch, which means you switch between too much left pedal and no left pedal at all, which is just, it's a pain. It's an absolute pain. And you can see we're now coming round onto our final approach intercept here. There you can see that we're starting to get the deviation bar coming in. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that it's got the approach for the glide path and vertical speed. And as this comes in, you'll see it change to green, and you'll see the glide slope indicator will come down as well. It's worth noting that in terms of GPS and RNAV, the deviation is a lateral deviation by position, as opposed to on a VOR or an ILS where it's lateral deviation by angle. So if you like, this is, if you were to maintain this position, you'd be paralleling the approach course, whereas if you were to maintain that in terms of a normal green needle nav or a normal ILS, what would be happening is you'd be on a constant angle offset. That's having a bit of a wobble, a bit of a think. It will swap over shortly, says he. There we go. It's picked up the localizer. Green diamond is coming down. What we're going to do is we're not going to go to the final stage of flap, because we'll leave that till we're out of the cloud. The reason I'm going to do that is if I then have to do a go around, final stage flap's quite draggy, so I'll leave it with one stage left to go, because what I can do is pop out the cloud and just immediately go, oh yep, boom, last stage of flap. You just got to watch the nose coming up, give it a good push forward and make sure that your speed doesn't decay at that point. But we'll do our approach at 70, which what we can do is as we get the flaps to about just before we're onto the glide slope, we'll just drop the next stage of flap, and you'll see the speed will drop off naturally as we do that. We'll give it a little bit of a reduction in power to help it out, and we'll come down at 70 knots. A little bit low, but we're alright. We can leave the altitude marker there as our missed approach altitude to recover to. As I say, missed approach is going to be dead ahead or straight ahead on runway, heading to 1500 feet, left turn back to Charlie India Tango. Nice straightforward climbing to 2,500 feet and then join the hold. Now the minimum holding altitude is 2,500 feet, so you just have to hope that nobody's at that altitude already. However, given that your normal join for the procedure is 3,500 feet, you'd anticipate that most people would be above you anyway. Going back onto green diamond nicely, on localizer nicely. Now, as I said before, we do have a check feature here for altitude, which is 1560 feet at the Charlie India Tango. Obviously the difficulty now is we've changed our nav and our GPS is being used, as opposed to previously when we had our pseudo NEB and the GPS wasn't the primary reference. What we have to do now is we have to sort of visually gauge it here over the Charlie India Tango and cross-refer it to 1560 feet on this, and it should be okay. I mean, the main reason you would do that is that ILSs have an occasional propensity for false glide slopes. So in effect what you get is you get your normal glide slope, but because of the signal propagation you can get sometimes 2 or 3, possibly even more glide slope indications above the normal glide slope. So you'd think you're on a normal glide slope, but the telltale indicators would be that your rate of descent would be much higher than normal. You may not even be able to maintain the speed of your approach. And likewise, things like this where you've got your check altitudes, it does a couple of things. The first thing is it confirms that your altimeter pressure setting is correct. It also confirms that you are flying an accurate approach in terms of your altimetry and your glide slope. So we would look at 1560 here as we pass the Charlie India Tango. What we could do if we really wanted was pull this up and look when we're on top. We're pretty much on top now. So 1580, 1560, yeah, that's good for me. I'll go with that. Just nudge the speed back towards 70. We don't really want to have too much speed if we can afford to fly at 70. I'm going to go down to 1560. What I'm going to do is I'll let it do its own thing, and then literally I'm going to take this off at the last moment, and then we'll chuck the flap down and land and see how we get on. Remember, 560 is the minima. We'll see a different symbol comes in, which is like a blue chevron that comes in from below. Always seems so slow when you're only at 70 knots. I mean, obviously it is. It's half the speed of most airliners' approaches, but it seems to take forever. It's a long time to be faffing around with stick and rudder if you're doing it manually. It's quite a long period to concentrate on, although at that speed it's not so hard compared to an airliner. So we've just passed 500 to go. Now. And we're continuing down very merrily. You can see outside here we're actually visual, so in real life you'd take over visual much earlier, but obviously we can't do that because we're going to see what this thing does. Obviously it hasn't got auto land, so we're not going to faff around with that nonsense, but we'll let it go down to close or at its minima, and we'll see what we get. Here's the minima indicator coming up here. Barrow mins. 200 to go on centerline and glide path. Coming up to 100 to go. And there we go, that's looking good for me. Take the autopilot off, last stage of flat, make sure we don't balloon and that our speed doesn't drop too much. Oh, this thing's hopelessly out of trim. I say that my controls are hopeless at managing trim, I should say. My joystick's starting to get very sticky, it probably needs a good clean. And we'll take those bananas. Right, let's bring it to a halt and we'll just quickly review that. So if you're doing an ILS, you need to be mindful that the first part of the procedure, if you're doing the procedure through the GPS, will be flown by the GPS, because obviously it's not going to know, it's not necessarily going to fly the tail of the needle, if you like, in terms of Charlie India Tango. Also, we don't have the NDB, so it's the only way it can really do it. Likewise, what we're going to do is when we come round, we're going to notice that we have to be ready for the changeover to needle nav. You have to not only load, but you also have to select the approach. So you select load and then you activate the approach in order for it to happen. And actually it's fairly straightforward. I think the RNAV ones are even more straightforward because they pretty much fly everything for you from the outset. But actually it's not too difficult at all really once you're familiar with setting it all up, and it's really quite an enjoyable process to go through. But hopefully that's beneficial in terms of how to do the ILS as opposed to RNAV off the procedures and using the autopilot. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, found something useful and beneficial out of it, and we're just sat here in the Cirrus jet, the X-Plane 11 default Cirrus jet, which shows another slightly different fit of the G1000. So instead of the audio panel you've got the undercarriage lever, pretty straightforward not to mix the two up. And likewise, if you remember, I mentioned about the autopilot controls down here. They're actually down here now, so a slightly different setup, but nonetheless it's pretty much identical in terms of operation of the equipment. So as I say, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to like, share or subscribe to the channel, and I shall speak to you soon. Take care.